Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Today, we're going to continue our discussion on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And it's a conflict because, well, Russia invaded Ukraine's democratic borders. And since that time, we have seen continual reports of continual shelling. Now we've seen reports of civilian targets as recent as a maternity hospital in Mariupol being targeted. The images are horrific. And I think we can all agree that this needs to stop. This war needs to stop. Russia needs to leave Ukraine, and we need to end this. But how does this end? How does Ukraine assert its democracy? What needs to happen with Russia? What needs to happen so that Russia will leave Ukraine's borders? Well, joining me now to share his perspective is Dr. Bohdan Klid, who's Director of Research at the Holodomor Research and Educational Consortium at the University of Alberta. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Klid. I appreciate your time today.
You're welcome.
I want to start, you're a Canadian of Ukrainian descent, so obviously this is, hits home for you very much. But perhaps you can give us a little bit of an update as what's happened in the last few days in Ukraine.
Right. Well, first of all, I'd like to comment on to the way you introduced the show. Russia-Ukraine conflict. It's not a conflict. It's an invasion, which you recognize later on. But so that, I think, needs to be really emphasized. And what's been taking place over the last week or so is you're seeing increasingly Russian bombardments of cities, hitting residential buildings. In Mariupol, if I can be sarcastic, the Russians launched a successful military strike against a maternity hospital. And we have basically a total war against Ukraine, a war of annihilation if it continues in this way.
It's shocking. You mentioned the maternity hospital, and I mentioned it in my opener as well. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And just recently I saw the image of a very pregnant woman who was dead, being carried out on a stretcher. Her unborn child had died. They both died. And apparently, according to this news source, her words were just, "Kill me now. If my child is dead, I want to die too." Something to that effect. And it was just, of course, it's shocking, but it's devastating. It's devastating. Whether it was an intended target or not, a maternity hospital was hit. This is, as a mother of 5 children, this really hits you. It hits home very much so. But let's take the emotion out of it for a second, and maybe we scale it back to several years ago in 2014. We saw a similar invasion, I suppose you could say, where Crimea was taken over by Russia. How did Europe handle that in 2014, and how did their actions back then bode for what we're seeing on the ground now?
Right. Well, let me, put this in some kind of conceptual framework. We can go back to 2014, but I would go back even further. I would go back to 1999, 2000, when Vladimir Putin, the current Russian president, came to power. He bombed to smithereens the capital of Grozny in the Caucasus. And the world witnessed that and said basically nothing. And then in 2008, he invaded Georgia and took a part of Georgia's territory. Again, the world reacted very, very meekly. In 2015 or 16, he bombed Aleppo, Syria, to smithereens. And again, Obama, the president of the United States, claimed that Russia shouldn't cross a red line, but when they did cross the red line, he did nothing. And then in 2014, previous to that, you had the takeover of Crimea and the launching of an insurrection that was controlled and basically directed by Russia, which included also the introduction of Russian troops into Ukraine. And the world reacted, I think, very, very meekly until that airliner was shot down. And only after then did more significant sanctions come to be applied. And Russia
okay,
still has not.
I'm gonna pause you there for a moment because we're gonna cut to a commercial break. But I'm glad you provided this context because I think our viewers need to understand what the lead up has been in our recent history to this invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion of the Russia invasion of Ukraine with Dr. Bohdan Klid from the University of Alberta. Dr. Klid, you so eloquently explained the very tumultuous recent past of tension between Russia and Ukraine and even bordering nations of Russia, and where Russia has taken action and, in your words, have seen a very meek response by the global community. What do you think should have happened in those circumstances, and would that have helped stave off what we're seeing today in Ukraine?
Well, yes, I think we can even go to let's say, making an analogy in our day-to-day lives in the school. If a bully starts to bully people, if that bully then starts to beat up on people, then that bully has to be stopped. And one has to use force against that bully if necessary. But in any case, the bully has to be isolated. The bully has to be, people have to coalesce and put the bully in his place. And this wasn't done, of course. Basically, the world looked the other way, closed their eyes. Germany in 2015 made a deal with Russia at the time to build that gas pipeline. And one can scratch one's head and say, well, how could they do that after Russia had basically invaded Ukraine and was conducting a slow motion war against Ukraine from 2014 until the war became a hot war just a few weeks ago?
Well, you mentioned the gas pipeline, and this is interesting because we did a whole show on, I guess, the world's reliance on Russian oil and gas. And if I could pull it delicately, I guess Germany is probably the biggest culprit of being the most reliant, or one of the most reliant countries, really close to Russia, physically in its proximity. You mentioned 2014, and again, that's when the annexation or the takeover of Crimea occurred. And you're right. Right after that, Germany struck a deal. Aside from putting boots on the ground, from foreign governments putting their own troops in Ukraine, which may or may not be welcome by Ukraine at this moment, that's for another discussion.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah. Well, let me just answer your question with another question. Why didn't the West impose sanctions earlier? Why weren't these penalties on Russia brought to bear when it invaded Georgia, or when they bombed Aleppo in Syria, or even earlier in 1999, 2000? Why was the world so willing to look the other way? I mean, this is the question that we have to pose to ourselves.
Well, why do you think that the world didn't? Why do you think that the West, that the United States, for example, didn't introduce sanctions with Crimea, for example, or Aleppo, or with Georgia?
Well, I think that they deluded themselves. They thought that they could treat the Russian leadership as they would the leaders of other countries, where they could, find some sort of a compromise. There were attempts to reach some sort of a modus vivendi, or some sort of an understanding with Russia. But again and again, the actions of Russia did not match the words. And we saw, leading up to this invasion, the Russian authorities were just lying. And we've seen lie after lie after lie. And this is almost incomprehensible that the Western leadership did not seem to comprehend where this was all going to head.
So now in 2022, they have introduced sanctions. Are they effective?
Well, they are effective. Finally, But the sanctions, as we've been told, will take a bit of time to bite. And of course, the Russian people themselves have to realize that their country is being led by a war criminal, basically a monster. And they have to come to terms with that. So they have to, first of all, I think, recognize that. And that's going to take some time because they've been fed this propaganda and they've believed in it. And most Russians still continue to believe in it.
Welcome back. We're going to continue our discussion on the Russia-Ukraine invasion. And joining me is Clint Ehrlich, foreign policy analyst, lawyer, and former visiting researcher at Moscow State Institute on International Relations. Clint, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so how did we get here? How did Russia come to the point where it has now essentially invaded Ukraine?
This really goes back to 2008 when, under the Bush administration, there was pressure for NATO to declare that Ukraine would ultimately become a member of NATO. Russia had made it clear that that was a red line for Russia, but at the time, Russia didn't have the capability to do anything about it. And so we've really been walking closer and closer to this conflict as Russia made ultimatums, issued a draft treaty to the United States and to NATO, and those were ignored. And people like me warned that Russia was serious about taking military action, but those warnings weren't heeded. And now we find ourselves in the midst of the worst large-scale military conflict in Europe since World War II.
Well, I would argue also there was the big conflict, obviously, in Croatia and Bosnia. That was a large one. I just correct that because I know people keep saying there hasn't been any conflict in Europe since World War II, but that was a huge one. And as a half Croat, I have to point that out. But
I would say that the scale of the militaries involved in this conflict is larger. And though the civilian casualties that occurred there were certainly horrifying, we didn't see a confrontation between militaries the size of the Ukrainian military and the Russian military.
Correct. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So when you mentioned, this sort of this climate of the red line started under the Bush administration, it blows my mind. That is so many presidents ago. We've had Bush, we've had Obama, we've had Trump, we've had now Biden. How did America just sit on the sidelines? And of course, we always look to America as, this kind of global police authority that will, enforce peace, if you will. How did America not do anything or not take note or not take this seriously?
Well, there was really an ideological difference between America and Russia. The Russians believed in something much closer to realpolitik, and the Americans had an ideological view of the world where abstract principles, like the idea that NATO should have an open door, were absolute and couldn't be compromised. And so when Russia drew this red line, the United States and its Western partners simply were unwilling to negotiate and to agree for Ukraine to not enter NATO, even though they didn't really want Ukraine in NATO. That's sort of the irony here, is that there were two paths that could have been walked. Either they could have walked back the declaration that Ukraine was going to join NATO, or they could have made Ukraine a member of NATO. And really both of those steps, either of them would have avoided this catastrophe. And instead they did the one thing that could have led them to war, which was to refuse to say that Ukraine wouldn't be a member of NATO, but to also fail to offer a security guarantee to deter Russia. And so it's really a perfect storm leading us into the conflict, and one that makes you wonder if it wasn't in the interest of the United States to have Russia invade, sort of like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was harmful to the Soviet Union.
So, and we'll come to that in a moment. But just for our viewers' perspective, why is it so concerning to Russia to have Ukraine as a member of NATO? Why is that their red line?
Well, it's important to understand that Russia sees NATO as an anti-Russian military bloc, the same way that the West saw the Warsaw Pact countries during the Cold War. And in particular, Russia was worried about the placement of de facto NATO bases already in Ukraine, like the Yaroslav Training Center that it just blew up yesterday. And it was also worried about the placement of missiles on Ukrainian territory. The Russians contended that those missiles would be strategically destabilizing because the flight time to Moscow could be as short as 5 minutes, forcing Russia to adopt a launch on warning posture that could threaten nuclear war.
And that's why we've seen such, I guess, alarmism and rhetoric come out of Russia, because they really just don't want Ukraine part of NATO. This is, we're talking missiles at their border, and this is why perhaps we can see why this elevated posturing has taken place. So apart from the NATO concern, we know that America imports several hundred thousands barrels of oil every day from Russia. How has America's, could we say, dependence on Russian oil factored into this conflict?
America's dependence on Russian oil is relevant, but it's really primarily Europe's dependence on Russian gas that has been the bigger factor. America has an interest in exporting its liquid natural gas to Europe in order to compete with the Russian pipelines that ship natural gas through Ukraine to Germany. And so there's really an argument to be had here that it's in the economic interest of the United States to have this conflict, precisely because it disrupts the supply of the competing gas, which can be provided at a lower price point than American exports. And so that's one of the reasons that I think that the United States has not done everything that it could to avoid this conflict, because there is a real economic benefit to America from exporting that gas at prices that otherwise would not be able to fetch on the open market.
Okay, that's quite the statement, and I want to unpack it right when we return from this commercial break. Welcome back. We're just continuing our discussion on the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and joining me again is Clint Ehrlich. Clint, before we went to commercial break, you said something that to me is quite shocking. You made a suggestion, and again, correct me if I'm paraphrasing it incorrectly, that there is an economic benefit to the U.S. for a prolonged crisis in Ukraine. Can you explain, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think that there's economic benefits to the United States from disrupting the flow of Russian gas into Europe because America is a competitor in that sector. America wants to export its liquid natural gas on ships. And so since this conflict has begun, Germany has announced plans to build new terminals actually for offloading liquid natural gas imports by ship, which it previously was not doing. It was not price competitive for it to make that kind of investment. And so America had an economic incentive both to instigate the conflict in the first place, and then today it has an economic incentive to avoid resolving the conflict. And I think that it's not just an economic benefit, but it's also a strategic benefit, because the Russian military is pinned down right now. They're taking significant losses. And so there's a real argument to be had that it advances America's strategic interest to keep Russia bogged down in a war in Ukraine.
Okay, so let's dial back to 2014. Crimea was annexed, taken over. Russia took it back, or took it rather. 2015, a year later, and our previous guest educated us on this, is Germany struck a deal to allow a pipeline into Germany, I believe, a Russian pipeline to pipe in natural gas. Why didn't Russia, or why didn't the U.S. administration then put pressure on Germany to not okay that deal, to not approve that, and to not invest in that, and to say, hey, take our gas instead? It's perhaps more ethical.
It just simply wasn't cost competitive. I mean, the Russians are able to offer gas to Germany at such a discount that it would have taken tremendous leverage and a tremendous investment of political capital from the United States to try to stop the Nord Stream pipeline from going through. And certainly U.S. administrations have flirted with sanctions on Nord Stream. They've made noise about stopping the pipeline. So it's not really a new issue or a surprise that America would be opposed to this. But until Russia invaded Ukraine, there really wasn't the popular will within Europe and within the United States to take the definitive actions needed to disrupt those Russian energy exports.
So knowing what you've just shared with us, that obviously there's an energy component to all of this, and we've seen fluctuations at the gas pumps, obviously not at our natural gas levels yet necessarily, but some are suggesting that has to do with the conflict going on, the Russia in Ukraine. What does the future look like? Because at the end of the day, I think we're all on the same page. This conflict needs to end. Ukrainian people, Russia needs to leave Ukraine. Ukrainians need to stop dying. Things need to stop. There needs an end to the shelling. We need to stop this war. How does that happen? And how does it happen with the U.S. as a leader or not as a leader in those talks?
There's an opportunity to end the conflict today. Russia has actually really dialed back the demands that it's making. Instead of talking about regime change in Kiev, the Russians have put forward offers to end the war if Kiev will agree not to join NATO, to recognize autonomy for the breakaway provinces in the east of Ukraine, and also to recognize that Crimea is Russian territory. And those may not be things that Kiev wants to do, but I think that they're reasonable enough that you could have an end to the conflict if America were to put pressure on the Ukrainian government to accept those demands. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. And so I think it's likely that the war is going to continue and frankly get a lot worse.
But does that not send a message that, hey, if you invade a democratic country and invade their borders, you'll get something out of it no matter what, because you'll speak from a position of power? And I understand that might sound naive. Obviously, we have a war going on and there's a lot of human casualty. But do we not just, punt that problem further down the road of Putin?
I think that the problem that we can avoid is one where Russia is invading NATO states. And if we draw a clear line here, especially given the frustration that the Russian military has faced in Ukraine, I think that Russia actually has less of an appetite for foreign aggression than it did before.
And again, a naive question, should we trust Russia? Should we trust that this is all that they want? They don't want anything further than this.
They may have had larger ambitions before this, but the experience of their military in Ukraine shows that they are not the superpower that they were projected to be. Frankly, I was wrong about their military capabilities going into the war. And so I think that the Russians are chastened, and we don't have to trust their intentions. Instead, we can look at their capabilities. And those are not capabilities today that suggest that they're on the verge of trying to, for example, take back the Baltic states. Okay,
Clint, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate your opinions.
Thank you.
This needs to end. Russia needs to leave Ukraine, and Ukraine needs to start rebuilding, and the people need to stop being shelled and bombarded. And we pray for those victims in Ukraine. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.